There is a great tone and determination to Simon Heffer's High Minds, the Victorians, and the Birth of Modern Britain, which came out some 7 years ago, in which Simon Heffer tries to instill in a contemporary audience, British audience, a belief in Britain that perhaps the Victorians themselves had. That's self-confidence. In it, really, he's trying to go through it. There is that melancholy element because we know how the empire pans out at the end. But he's still trying to combat what Lytton Strachey had begun with his eminent Victorians in denigrating the Victorian or chastising them, looking at them through a lens of satire, that their great acts were really not so great, that they were petty men with petty beliefs, backwards looking, insular. The empire fell upon them and they abused it. This is the Lytton Strachey view, and Heffer's going to try to bite back at that and say, no, there were real characters there who we should look back on with admiration, who dealt with a changing landscape, industrial landscape, and the chaotic forces that were unleashed with that revolution. And statesmen that Strachey tried to deride actually conducted themselves with great earnestness, great valour. And there is characteristics in these people, in these men of the Victorian age, and some women, that we can draw ideas and beliefs from today. In his prologue, he starts off with the towering figure of Dr. Thomas Arnold of Rugby, schoolmaster of Rugby in the 1820s and 30s, who reformed the way the school system was taught to behave, and had done so with a great sense of moral purpose, bred the sort of characters who would then, in later generations, go on to fill England, the empire, and her role in the 19th century. So from the start, Heffer looks in Arnold as a figure who could instill a moral belief in the rest of them. Starts out with the singular figure and will broaden out from then. So it's very interesting to delve a little bit deeper into what these moral purposes that possessed Arnold were. There are 3 key takeaways from the Victorian social development that we see the kernels of in Thomas Arnold. He thought that without a sense of moral purpose, moral leadership, that the affluence of the few might well have been destroyed by the revolution of the masses. So there is a rearguard to happen against mass revolt, which brings with it only dislocation and confusion. The second, once you have found your moral purpose as an affluent person in a leadership position, you have to come up with the proper methods that will lead you from the feudal nation to the industrial democratic one. A system which, through the tide of the great movement of people, will bring the end of feudalism. You have to understand how to manage that great movement, this other revolution, the industrial revolution. So from the first part, your moral purpose is to avoid a repeat of what has happened in France in the late 18th century, but also to realize that the forces unleashed in the Industrial Revolution will change the remaining feudal landscape of England forever, and you have to be ready to reform that. The third is that you need to instill a particularly religious morality in the people, that a secular moralism towards the democratic nation, which we saw in part 2, is not enough. There needs to be a Christian underpinning to the entire act, and a motivation has inspired and enabled to undertake the great movements with the zeal required. So Thomas Arnold, by being headmaster of Rugby, was trying to install this great Christian moral religion in the time. For trying to install this third ingredient of Victorian social development, Lytton Strachey and his eminent Victorians decided to mock Thomas Arnold. Strachey, of course, was a member of the 20th century Cambridge Apostles, an intriguing group, but ultimately the ones who created a poor case for Britain in the 20th century, who were a forebringer of decadent intellectualism, aloof and disregarding to the course that the nation itself was on. What did Dr. Thomas Arnold try to do then? Well, he tried to teach a narrow range of subjects more imaginatively. And we can see in no more than his son Matthew Arnold, the great poet and political thinker, that these traits were inherited. Matthew Arnold, in his Culture and Anarchy, would instill the words of his father with "Estote ergo vos perfecti," be ye perfect. And it was certainly Dr. Thomas Arnold's wish that he could bring out the perfection among the best. He transformed what had been a fair specimen of a debauched and riotous establishments known as public schools into the character-building, God-fearing, scholarship-winning model for reform in the 1840s and 50s. He was responsible, ultimately, for staffing the empire. Yet he struggled with the 39 Articles. The Articles had defined Anglicanism after the Reformation as distinct from Roman Catholicism. We can see his attempt to breed a core group of religious leaders when he stood before an assembled school and said, "It is not necessary that this should be a school of 300 or 100 or of 50 boys, but it is necessary that it should be a school of gentlemen, Christian gentlemen." Of course, sexual impropriety was the great unmentionable, and in all his sermons remained unmentioned. He also made it clear that it was not just he who was judging, and if necessary punishing them. God, too, was taking notes. So once you've emerged with this Christian manliness, it can be derided, and indeed Thomas Hughes was one of Arnold's pupils, who would later go on to write Tom Brown's School Days. Nevertheless, Arnold expected complete commitment. He should be public-spirited liberal, and entering heartily into the interest, honour, and general respectability and distinction of the society which he has joined. Said Arnold, he was very in tune with the idea that those you possessed in your company were a mirror to your own character. He was opposed to the utilitarian notion that saw education as cramming the mind with facts. Yet he brought in mathematics, some Shakespeare, whom he felt grossly inferior to Homer, and also Dante and Goethe. The classics, of course, remained in a state of primacy in his teachings. The history of Greece and of Rome is not an idle inquiry about the remote ages and forgotten institutions, he would say, but a living picture of things present, fitted not so much for the curiosity of the scholar as for the instruction of the statesman, the citizen. He retained flogging, as fitly answering to the marking and naturally inferior state of boyhood. Flogging will be only my ratio ultima, and taking I shall try to the utmost. So it would exist, but it would be there as a treatment of last resort. He also believed in the great saying that deeds must second words when needful, or words will soon be laughed at. And to sum up his 3 stages of what man needed when he had turned from boy to man in his schoolings was first, religious and moral principles; secondly, gentlemanly conduct; thirdly, intellectual ability. By the time of Lytton Strachey, writing during the First World War would become something to be mocked. Arnold's dictum that nowhere is Satan's work more evidently manifest than in turning holy things to ridicule figures to be ridiculed in eminent Victorians. The Great War, says Heffer, which destroyed the credibility of values such as Arnold propagated, He was the product of the Victorian and Edwardian public school systems, of which he was the father. That they were buried then in the First World War, in sickening large numbers, in the cemeteries of the Western Front, killed in a conflict with Strachey's own physical feebleness prevented him from participating. His exemption from military service on the grounds of health prevented him from the satisfaction of registering as a conscientious objector. We should think then that the whole idea of the men of the British Empire, bred by Arnold into roles and positions of leadership, found their end there on the Western Front, while Strachey, back at home, wrote with the mocking pen. We can also see failure in the successor in education to Arnold. Charles Vaughan became headmaster of Harrow from 1844 to 1859 and was seen as a protege of Arnold. Harrow was a shambles when Vaughan took it over, says Heffer, and he was warned not to throw himself away on it. God was also at the centre of Vaughan's work, though, and he went earnestly. Yet Vaughan failed to police the depravity, and that suggests that he lacked Arnold's rigour. But let us never forget the true dictum of Arnold. Men who applied their high minds to the improvement of people, to the world in which they lived, and the institutions that ruled them, were great. And Dr. Thomas Arnold, despite all the jibes that Strachey may throw at him, is in that pantheon.